Welcome to the Diesel Podcast presented by DFC Diesel. Karen, welcome back to the Diesel Podcast. I'm extremely excited to chat with you today and I appreciate your time and welcome back.
Thanks for having me back, Patrick. It's fun to be here again.
I really enjoyed our last conversation and a lot of people viewed it, but for anyone who didn't see our last episode, just briefly tell me about yourself, what you do at SEMA, what your focus is, then we'll jump into the main topic of the day, which is EPA deregulation.
Sure. So I'm the Senior Vice President of Public and Government Affairs for SEMA and PRI. The short form is that I oversee all of our legislative and regulatory work on behalf of the industry and based here in Washington, D.C.
Very cool. Well, you're the perfect person to chat with because that I think it was a couple weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, there was some huge news, which was the EPA deregulation proposal, and Lee Zeldin, did a speech, and since then, YouTube and other platforms have just been on fire with questions, speculation. So I thought it'd be great to have you on. This is what you work on and are familiar with, and what your expertise is in. What is this recent deregulation proposal that the EPA has set forth?
Sure. So there's actually a lot of different. The EPA is going through a whole deregulatory process, and they've obviously adopted a very America Energy first agenda, also to empower American automotive and our manufacturing sector across the board. So there's a massive amount of deregulation happening across industries, including the automotive industry. So there's a few different things that have come out with regards to what the EPA is doing. But before I get into the actual the endangerment finding and the rule or the announcement that they made a couple of weeks ago, is there's a difference between rules and regulations and the law. So the law is created by Congress, they pass it, and then the agency, the federal agency, whether that's EPA or any other agency, they're the ones that develop the rules for people to then follow the law that Congress passes. And so there's sort of two different things that we're dealing with here. So the agency has the ability to adopt new rules and regulations, but it has to be congruent with what the law says, which I can get into the Supreme Court decisions on that. I think we may have talked about that the last time about the Chevron deference. So what the endangerment finding is in particular in the notice that the EPA put out as it relates to diesel engines and specifically DEF, is the fact that they're actually asking the automakers, the OEs, to go back and readjust their software about how DEF behaves inside a vehicle, i.e. specifically the limp mode. And it's not just actually automotive vehicles. A lot of this is geared towards the agricultural sector. Again, somebody running a combine on diesel, not great to be in limp mode while you're in harvesting. And there's a lot of different applications there. And so what the EPA has done is gone back to the automakers to say, we want you to reconfigure your software so you're not so onerous in terms of how your vehicle behaves when you get low or run out of DEF. As a diesel owner, there's nothing scarier than when the alert starts going off and you're not really sure if you're going to make it to find some fluid. But what it doesn't do, what the EPA's most recent announcement doesn't do, is that it doesn't change the law. The law still remains that you cannot delete, defeat, tamper with an emissions control functionality. So you cannot take your cats off. You cannot bypass your DEF systems. That is still illegal. To change that would require an act of Congress. That is not likely to happen anytime soon, if ever. But really what the EPA is doing is trying to lessen the burden of those of us that drive diesel, whether you're in the automotive sector or agricultural or other industries, to lessen some of the burden that the OEs have, of these systems that the OEs have put in, which is DEF or utilizing DEF in order to meet the NOx regulations.
It's an excellent explanation. If I step back for a second and say I'm not very familiar with this endangerment finding in 2009, wasn't it something that at that point, would it be an interpretation of the law to create a rule that would have added or even forced or directed, I'm not sure the right word to use, but say the big three into how they produce trucks in the future? And then as those rules have been adjusted, that's where we see different either components on these vehicles that come from the factory. So the EPA is stepping back and saying, okay, we're going to not follow this particular rule from 2009. We're going to adjust them for a number of different reasons, whether it's business or safety. I think I read that in their proposal about emergency use vehicles, things like that. But it's not saying you don't have to have anything on your truck at all, which is a lot of what I saw from commentators and on social media that was the impression.
Exactly. Yeah, I think a lot of people are really hoping and praying that all of this work will eliminate our emissions control systems, and that is not correct. Because again, that is dictated by the Clean Air Act, the Federal Clean Air Act, which is a law passed by Congress. But you bring up a really good point about the endangerment finding and dating back to the 2009. It was actually stemmed out of a lawsuit that was brought by the state of Massachusetts. And essentially, and I'm going to go back into more geekier legal history, but I'm going to sort of fast forward to 2024. So I think everyone remembers the announcement about the U.S. Supreme Court reversing what was called the Chevron deference and overturning the Chevron deference. And what the Chevron deference did was it set a precedent in the court saying that the courts had to listen to the agencies when they interpreted a law that was either ambiguous or silent. And so if the EPA says carbon dioxide is a pollutant, and we say, because we say it so, then the courts had to listen to that. So when the Supreme Court changed that, actually about a year ago, almost exactly a year ago, they said, actually, no. The fact is that you still have to go back to the law as the law. The courts can listen to the agency and take their advice, but they do not have to defer to the agency of how they've interpreted an area of the law that is either vague, silent, ambiguous, whatever the case may be. And so that's exactly where this endangerment finding actually came from back in 2009, in terms of, number one, utilizing this sort of structure to decide if there is an endangerment to the population, in which not only were they trying to name carbon dioxide as a pollutant, but there were actually I think there was a total of six other gases, if you will, that they included in this, of which some of them weren't even emitted by vehicles. So it's basically challenge now, sort of taking where the Supreme Court made a good decision last year, now sort of using that lens to narrow the regulations and really what EPA's authority is in determining what is and what isn't a pollutant. Because the reality is the Federal Clean Air Act, when it was passed went into effect in 1970, the EPA is allowed to regulate vehicle emissions, but they were not allowed to do things like the separate gases or assign certain definitions to where the law was silent or ambiguous.
Hey, Diesel fans, we wanted to let you know that our friends over at Kershaw Knives have a 20% off your entire cart discount code for you. If you go to kershaw.kaiusa.com, use code TDP2520, get you 20% off your entire order. They got a bunch of different choices for blade steel, blade shape, different handle designs, different opening mechanisms. So if you're in the market for a new knife for EDC or hunting, fishing, around the job site, around the house, they've got you covered with a bunch of different choices designed to meet any budget. We really appreciate them offering that discount code just for you guys. So if you're in the market, head on over to kershaw.kaiusa.com and use code TDP2520 and get 20% off your entire cart. How does this process work with a proposal? I think the limited knowledge I have is it's open for public comment, and I think until September. And then, let's hypothetically or probably say that they proceed and say, okay, we're going to ignore the 2009 endangerment or not follow it. Do lawsuits start next? Like, how does it actually direct the agency?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There is a process. So everything that you've seen out of the EPA, whether it's the endangerment filing or the endangerment finding, the greenhouse gas emissions regulations, and some of the other stuff that's come out of the Supreme Court, or excuse me, out of the EPA, most of the stuff will be subject to the public comment period. So there is a process in terms of adopting regulations. And so this is essentially a new or a revised regulation. And so they have to go through that process. So The public comment period is open until September 15th, in which then the agency will then review the public comments and then issue their final ruling. So typically that process takes between 6 to 8 months. Obviously, this is the EPA under Administrator Zeldin has been gung-ho and ready to get things done and again clear the way for American manufacturing. So I don't know that they're going to drag their feet. They even put in their announcement, we're not going to prejudge the outcome of how we're going to find on this rule, but obviously they're not asking the question if they don't have a different way of looking at the existing regulations or how they've been interpreted since. So you'd expect the fact that this is going to ultimately resolve, or we'll have some finality to it in 6 to 8 months. At that time, interested parties can in fact sue. They will have to go through their own process, whether that's the environmental community, maybe the state of Massachusetts may revisit it because they were the ones that sort of originated this whole rule or this interpretation of the rules. And so people will decide whether or not they're going to challenge this. This is where the really nerdy constitutional lawyers take a hard look at it, because again, going back to the Chevron, the overturn of Chevron last summer, quite frankly, anybody challenging this rule better have a really good case and some kind of silver bullet that they've identified that would in fact, maybe satisfy the Supreme Court's decision last summer.
Was this endangerment finding, is that what has driven motor vehicle emissions since 2009? Some of the changes that have happened. Like I had an oil company on recently, and we were talking about how that changes oil formulations in 2027. And I was curious if that is what has driven most of what we deal with, what SEMA deals with, the questions I get on a podcast related to trucks and vehicles.
Yeah, and I won't, my depth of knowledge of going into specific, changes as each regulation has come into place is I don't want to go too deep into that, because again, is by law allowed to regulate vehicle emissions, and they've been able to obviously set forth stricter emissions as time has gone on. But then there's also, again, how they determine emissions or what they're regulating, what emission they're regulating, again, in the endangerment filing that was around carbon dioxide and treating carbon dioxide as a pollutant. And so there's a little bit of both. There is the legal or the law that allows the EPA to regulate vehicle emissions. It's the how that is really what's under question right now, or has been under question for a number of years by our industry, which now the current EPA is taking action on, and again goes back to even to DEF and sort of what the solution was for automakers to manage their NOx emissions. And this was a solution, and this is how they sort of enforced it themselves with the consumer. And now it's the EPA. So in the case of like the DEF issue, is that the EPA is actually kind of giving automakers direction / permission to adjust their software system so that it becomes a lot more consumer friendly to how this is all implemented. So that one actually isn't even a rule that's going to go through the rule processing. It's guidance that is sort of alleviating, again, the pressures on the automakers, which ultimately alleviates the pressures on the rest of us down the line, whether that's the aftermarket or ultimately the consumer.
Okay, so to recap that,
can you? I dare you in 5 words or less.
Oh, I don't know if I can do 5. It took me a little bit more. But for existing vehicles on the road, this has nothing to do with a truck that's registered driving, on a road. It doesn't affect really the aftermarket at all for existing vehicles. However, would that be correct for me to say?
Actually, it's not technically correct. So the EPA has asked the automakers to start to implement the new software programming systems, however it is that they manage their DEF systems. That is to begin in model year 27. However, in what they wrote, they also sort of suggested strongly that they find a way for consumers with older vehicles or the vehicles that are already on the road to also adjust software systems, or find a way to adjust the software systems in order for the vehicles that are currently in the DEF system, that are utilizing DEF systems, of how to again make it more consumer friendly.
Okay, That makes sense. I had a listener, and he said, I spent all night going through this proposal. I think it's 300 plus pages, and he gave me these pages where he had questions, and I read through it 3 or 4 times, and I didn't understand. But there was some language, and I apologize, I don't remember the exact language. It was either life use or use of life for these emission systems that was mentioned in this proposal. And I think where he was going with it was, is there going to be a time limit where the EPA says your emission system should last, say, 10 years or 8 years or 12 years? And then if it doesn't, what is the process for repairing or replacing it? Is that something that's going to be a component in this proposal where there's a time limit they expect it to live, and then when that comes up, what happens next?
Yeah, so that's actually already in practice right now, is that you have to have X amount, you have to do your testing based on X amount of life cycle, whatever the vehicle may be and whatever the engine system is that you're utilizing. In terms of replacement, I mean, that's sort of one of the questions that the industry is looking at, and members that I know of within the industry are looking at, is saying, okay, then what about replacement? Because there are replacement catalytic converter systems. There are replacement. The thing is that I think you go back to the bottom line, and that is, what is the law? And the law says you cannot alter or remove your emissions control system outside of what the original usage or practical application has been. So, we always get into the conversation of, you can get more horsepower, as long as you don't change the emissions profile of the vehicle. And so the same thing, I think, will essentially prevail because, again, you can't tamper with that catalytic converter or any kind of emissions control system.
I think the big section that my mind goes to is to the design of future vehicles. If we assume that this proposal goes forward, goes through the lawsuit procedure, and it's just what the EPA uses, that it could definitely change what we find at dealer lots and what the OEMs offer. And I think there's excitement with the truck enthusiast community. I think their first thought is, I'm going to be able to go buy a new Power Stroke, Cummins, or Duramax, and there's no EGR, there's no DPF, there's no SCR on it. What should people keep in mind with this proposal, how it could potentially change what the OEMs offer? Is it going to be a dramatic change? Is it just going to be, like you mentioned with the software, maybe it isn't going into fail-safe or limp mode so quick? I think I read something with start-stop technology, which was, I think, before this proposal, but that was something the EPA had talked about getting rid of. So some of these other technologies which maybe aren't going to be required, but I don't think the truck enthusiast understands or knows, and I don't know, what does this actually mean for what I'm going to buy at a dealer lot in a couple of years?
Or so again, how that software system behaves in terms of DEF deliverability or the behavior of the vehicle should you run out of DEF. So the automatic stop, you're going to be stuck on the side of the road, but even the limp mode, which right now is at a very, very low miles per hour. I think it's like 30 or 35, which obviously poses a danger for those of us with vehicles on the road. So anyway, so that's really where, to the extent of where this current announcement has been made, is dealing directly with the software. Are the automakers, I mean, I'm not going to speak obviously on behalf of the automakers, but I think the fact that anybody thinking that there's just going to be a light switch turned on and sort of all of the technology that we've been dealing with is going to change overnight, that's not the case. Because at the end of the day, when you think about product development, developing a new model year, that's usually 4+ years in development. And so because you have some uncertainties in between, so i.e. the court case, let's assume somebody will sue the EPA once they issue their final rule. Then there's a court case. And again, I'm getting away from the DEF side of it and back to the endangerment, because again, how they're doing DEF is a little bit different procedurally. But then there's a court case. When you look at any kind of a court case, you're looking at 2, 3, 4 years for potential resolution, because, plaintiffs file a case, then it goes to the lower court, decide if they have standing, then they do all the oral arguments, filings, all that kind of stuff. So, and then, if the lower court doesn't, side with the plaintiffs, or actually if the lower court, makes whatever decision they make, and whether the plaintiffs lose or the defendants lose, then they have the ability to appeal to the Supreme Court. and then the Supreme Court decides whether they're going to hear it or not, and so there's a lot of legal procedural stuff happening. So in the meantime, you've got OEs and also the aftermarket developing products. Well, when we don't even know when that court case, when you've got like a 2-3+ year potential judicial review of that process, so we're already 2 to 3 years out potentially. But then here's the other kicker: is that the guy in the White House and the one who's put Administrator Zeldin in place, we know he's not going to be there after 2028. All political joking aside, there's going to be somebody new, and so maybe that new person may be a more pro-regulatory person. So that person may have a policy of like, okay, so everything that was done by this administration, I'm going to do the complete opposite, and then I'm going to start, re-regulating, and which then also starts lawsuits again.
Yeah.
So, now the positive part of it, and again, this is that sort of nerding out on the constitutional law part of this, is that the good news part of this is the fact that then we go back to the Chevron deference, and the fact that now the courts are better positioned, or the industry is better positioned within the courts as to how the courts are now required to treat agency deference or agency interpretation of laws. So again, those that operate in the constitutional law space are going to tend to be pretty careful about what cases they take on, because you want to have a case that's going to have the best potential outcome, or the best opportunity for a good outcome. Because if it goes opposite to what you're hoping for, now that becomes the case law, that becomes the standard. So on both sides, both on the industry side and as well as environmental side, people are probably going to be a little bit more cautious about what cases they bring, in terms of how EPA in this case is going to behave and to challenge those decisions.
Hey, diesel fans, I wanted to chat with you about diesel fuel. It's something we've talked about a lot on the podcast, and specifically ways that it can lead to a lot of costly repairs. And the main reason that we have these issues is a lack of lubricity. Our friends over at Hot Shot Secrets have developed a formula that boosts performance and then addresses this issue. So whether you have an old truck, new one, something, anywhere in between, we all face this issue. Hot Shots EDT is a 6-in-1 formula. It cleans injectors, boosts cetane, and it has 4 times the lubricity as their leading competitor. So it's a great way to be able to stay ahead of the maintenance curve, avoid those costly repairs, and the best part is it does the work for you. So all you do is add it to your regular fuel up schedule, and it's doing all the heavy lifting. So you don't have to worry about some of those issues that just come with diesel fuel anytime we buy it from the pump. If you go to hotshotsecret.com, use code DIESELPOD20. It'll get you 20% off your order. We really appreciate the team and our friends over at Hot Shot Secret offering this discount code just for you guys. So if you're in the market, head on over to their website, use code DIESELPOD20 and get 20% off your order. Common question we get from you guys a lot is, hey, I need a diesel engine. I either, I can't wait this long to get one, or normal place I get stuff from it just takes too long, or they don't have the parts in it that I need. Maybe my truck's not stock, or I tow heavy with it. I don't want to go back with just a stock engine. DFC Diesel is a sponsor of the podcast. We worked with them, hand in hand on doing episodes, answering technical questions. They have a complete lineup of Cummins, Duramax, and Power Stroke remanufactured engines that are set to a standard of ISO 9001 2015 standards, which is a huge deal in the aftermarket. And there's certain levels of quality testing, validation that are required for that. So when you get one of those engines, the type of quality that's built behind it, with an industry-leading warranty that's really comprehensive. And the other thing with that is, sometimes the options that are out there, it's a basic OEM engine. You want a little bit more. You don't want to have the same failure again. So there's a bunch of different series of engines that they have, from core, street, tow haul, and also the Speed of Air series, which we've covered on the podcast before. There's a lot of really cool benefits to it. And if you have questions about that, reach out to them. If you don't know the type of engine that you're looking for, if you go to dfcdiesel.com, there's a ton of info there. You can send an email or you can reach out to them. Also, they're working with Speed of Air pistons, which it's the only piston that pays for itself. And there's a lot of really cool technology behind it. So you can add that into your build and be able to get better fuel economy, increased power, increased torque, and better engine life out of it. Some of the most common engine applications or series of engines that they have with that lead time, a lot of them are in stock or they have really short lead times. So you can check your favorite retailer or go to dfcdiesel.com, check them out, see what's in stock, see what you can get. If you have questions, maybe you want to do something that's outside of the normal series of engines, they have tons of choices for rods, cranks, pistons, valve train upgrades, tons of different things. So if you're in the market, definitely make sure and head on over and check them out. That makes sense. I think from the aftermarket perspective, which is what SEMA leads the way with, is the uncertainty that is there. Like I imagine from a lot of members, they're not going to do a 180 on their product line right now. And then they're also looking, like you mentioned, towards the future, what happens in 3 years, what happens in 8 years, and the time involved in development. It doesn't necessarily change what they do. They have to focus still on what are these vehicles, how do these vehicles operate within the Federal Clean Air Act? And
exactly.
And what arises. So I think it's been, like when I was in college, I was a political science major and I love politics. I still do. I still love to read about it and kind of nerd out and read things and try to understand how all this works. But it's such a complex process. And especially when we apply it towards something that can be really personal to people, which is their vehicle that they spent money on or they use for work or they built their business around. And maybe they're a SEMA member and they have a shop somewhere. And you have these huge, complex topics like the EPA and the Clean Air Act and federal law and state law. How does all this fit together? And so it's really helpful to talk with an expert like yourself. This is what you specialize in, to understand how this fits into everyday life, into business, into what we may be able to buy one day. Maybe we don't have to worry about fail-safe mode so quick, or what it does at certain points. And I think people are really excited though as well, in the sense of with this deregulation, the either freedom or the power it gives them over their equipment, like you mentioned with agriculture, or their personal vehicle. And it's not fun to be stuck in fail-safe and be on the highway or be on a road or something like that. So people are hopeful, but I really wanted and appreciate your time today talking about how to temper that excitement a bit with the reality of the Federal Clean Air Act, what an agency can and can't do, what happens with lawsuits. If it is something that the administration directs an agency to do, how that can change so quickly every 4 years or every 8 years, what happens, and then how do you build your business around this? How do you, as a SEMA member, how do I focus and take care of my customers and do it within this framework of this huge topic like federal law and agencies
and case law and Supreme Court and all of that kind of stuff. And I think
Mm-hmm.
it's, I think the important part here too, and I think this is sort of, again, why SEMA took up the mantra of the EV mandates in specific. Well, we did obviously both the federal as well as the California ones, but we're obviously very active on the ones that the California waiver request that was granted by the Biden administration that would have ultimately outlawed the internal combustion engine. Outside of the fact that it impacts 33% of our industry. So it would have just killed our industry if that was allowed to go because of the 16 other states that followed California. So there's a huge issue for our industry. But the reason why we weren't satisfied with just the president issuing an EO to overturn or withdraw that waiver for California was twofold. Number one is that we've been in this pendulum swing for 15 years. One guy says yes, one guy says no, one guy says yes, one guy says no. And so again, when you look at product development, certainty for the future for our industry and the people making these products, that's not a way to build a business, and also for the OEs, quite frankly. So that was number one. But number two, the reason why we pushed, so with that said, the reason why we pushed so hard for the use of the Congressional Review Act, which is what Congress passed, the president ultimately signed, saying they're basically revoking the California exemption on the ICE ban / EV mandates, as well as a couple others that related to the trucking, more towards the trucking industry, is it was the first time it's the first time Congress, since the passage of the Federal Clean Air Act, which allows California the exemptions and the ability to apply for a waiver from the EPA, it's the first time Congress has actually set boundaries around California. Because California has just been pushing, trying to force national policy from their part of the world onto the rest of us. You see that with, again, the 16 states that follow California emissions regulations. This is the first time Congress has actually said in writing, where sort of things start and stop with California, and that's also incredibly important. There's another lawsuit that we actually did an amicus brief on. This is the Diamond Energy case, also related to all of these emissions policies. But Justice Kavanaugh, in writing for the majority, which actually gave like trade associations like SEMA the standing to sue on behalf of their industry. That was the question the Supreme Court answered earlier this year. But Justice Kavanaugh actually referenced Congress's action on California in his opinion for the majority, which is pretty cool, because that actually all happened right around the same time when so it was like, well, that's neat. Of course, it was one of the lawyers that we hired externally to help us with all this smart people stuff. So he was the one that noticed it. I didn't notice it at first. I was just like, we won, yay! I'm very simple that way. So again, all of this kind of stuff, this is a long game. This is it's a marathon, not a sprint. But again, the work that we're doing, the issues that we're engaging on, and how we're approaching all of this is, for me, it's always about stability. How do we create the most stability for our industry going forward, for the broadest number of our membership, so that people have the ability to plan for the future. So they also have a path to compliance with federal law, and to just, again, create that certainty going forward, not just for 4 years, but for a much longer runway for our industry.
It's incredibly important. What are some things that we should pay attention to that maybe you guys are working on, or that we should be just, I don't want to say hopeful, but what are some other things that may be coming up that, as an enthusiast or a member of SEMA or somebody in the industry, that might give us more of that stability, or things you guys are working on, or what would you suggest we pay attention to?
So I think, as the emission stuff kind of keeps sort of trickling out there, and again, everyone's going to hear about the lawsuits back and forth, and this decision, that decision, more dereg out of the EPA, all good stuff. But I think from a legislative perspective, our next big issue, which impacts the industry well beyond emissions, is our push for right to modify. And so SEMA has been actively involved in right to repair legislation for years, obviously very supportive. One of the issues we took issue with the Federal Right to Repair Act is the fact that it sort of only kind of gets the specialty aftermarket kind of only up to a certain point, because a lot of it's really focused on sort of the repair and replace part of the industry, and not on the specialization, customization, modification beyond that. And so we've taken a bit of a different course of action this year, and have been working on the Hill very diligently. We're also going to be submitting comments to the Department of Transportation in a couple of days, actually tomorrow, with regards to how do we preserve the right to modify, and why does that matter? One of the things is that technology has changed. We all know that. And so when you used to modify a vehicle, a lot of it was largely mechanical. You lift it, you lower it, you put bigger tires on, you do whatever. You put different bumper on, aftermarket, side view mirrors, whatever it is that you do. Now with the advanced driver safety systems called ADAS, all of that's obviously computerized. And it's also all managed through software updates over the air, so telematics and so forth. And so now because you have all these sensors that help either, keep you from colliding into the vehicle in front of you, or from departing, keeping you inside your lane, or beeping at you when you're getting too close to the line. None of those technologies, other than forward collision or automatic emergency braking, are actually mandated or regulated yet, but essentially we all know regulation will eventually happen. And so the fact is that we want to make sure that the modifications that our industry, modification products our industry produces, and what consumers put on their vehicles, we want to make sure that there is a pathway and a certainty, so that our products can talk to the other products, and make sure that all of the calibrations are in line, so that the vehicles remain safe to operate, especially as we anticipate these safety technology regulations going forward. So it's kind of like what emissions was 40 years ago, when everyone was trying to figure out, what do we do with this emissions thing? We're now on the forefront of right to modify, and how vehicles today behave. And we just want to make sure that, again, for the stability and longevity of our industry, that these mechanisms are in place so that our products can talk to the vehicle that consumers are purchasing off the lots today and going forward.
Hey, Diesel fans, let me ask you something. Who's got eyes on your online life? You probably think it's just you, but it's not. There's shady data brokers, advertisers, even your internet provider. They're all watching you. Every site you visit, every order you make, every video you watch, it's all tracked, stored, and sold. And in the diesel world, we know privacy matters. You wouldn't leave your shop wide open for anyone to walk in, right? So why do it online? That's where ExpressVPN comes in. It reroutes everything you do on the internet through secure encrypted servers. That means your IP address, which is your digital license plate, is hidden. Nobody can use it to track you, target you with ads, or worse. And here's the kicker. ExpressVPN works on all your devices. Phones, tablets, desktops, even your smart TVs. It's one click and you're locked in. Up to 8 devices at once, so your whole family's covered. Plus, if you're like me and you hate when Netflix blocks certain shows because of where you live, ExpressVPN lets you watch shows and movies from other countries. It's like having a giant toolbox of content that's usually locked up. Right now, Diesel Podcast listeners can get 4 extra months of ExpressVPN for free when you sign up for a 2-year package. Just go to expressvpn.com/diesel. That's expressvpn.com/diesel. Protect your privacy, protect your family, and take back control of your internet. It's really inspiring, I think, the time that we're in. I think it was in March or earlier this year, you and I had chatted about the internal combustion engine and the California waiver. Yeah. And now, about 6 months later, we're talking about this deregulation from the EPA, and I'm thinking about the right to modify and what a great thing it is for the automotive industry. And I wanted to do a quick 180 here before I let you go. I was just thinking, like when you get towards the end of like your bachelor's or undergrad studies, and it's like that last semester, and then all the companies come in, and it's like, okay, where do I want to go work? What do I want to go do? Well, I was thinking back. I thought if there would have been like a SEMA booth, or I knew that there was automotive legislation or policy to work on, that would have been the career I did, and I could have saved myself like 10 years or 15 years of trying to figure out what I want to do. And we have a lot of younger people who are finding the podcast and listening to it, and they love automotive, whether it's diesel, whether it's gas, any part like that. And they understand that the way to impact the industry and the way to create change, or the way to keep this going, is on the side that you're on. If you were going to give a couple tips to somebody who's younger, who has heard your podcast, and they go, I want to do exactly what she does. I want to be on the front line in DC with policymakers, helping the automotive aftermarket. What tips would you give somebody to get into that field?
Or gosh, don't take the path I did. So it was long and arduous. No, I'm just kidding. It's actually been an incredible path. As I always sort of synopsize my career, is that I've always represented highly regulated, highly scrutinized industries. That's kind of the common theme of my career. And I think if automotive is your passion, and automotive is where you want to even have a political career in automotive, then start to create that path. Go find a job, go volunteer on a political campaign. Start to build out your resume. I was actually just advising a young person today who wants to get into politics. He has a political science degree, but hasn't spent any time volunteering. I'm like, go volunteer right now. Go get on a campaign. He lives in Virginia. They have elections this year. Go get on a campaign. I don't care if the person loses. Get on the campaign, because that's when you're going to get to know people. That's how you're going to start to build your network. That's how you're going to get some experience. You're going to understand some of the tactical pieces of it. And when I say go join a campaign, I mean volunteer. Don't expect payment necessarily, but if you get a paid job, awesome. But then also, try to forge a path in your state legislature, or come to Washington to either, especially in Washington, you have the ability to either try to get a job on the Hill, which is obviously challenging, but there's tons of political organizations, political advocacy organizations here in Washington that do different work on different issues, whether it's industry specific like ours, or oil and gas, or the coal industry, or whatever the case is, to just tax policy and economic policy and all that kind of stuff. And go get those jobs, take those opportunities, and start to learn the policy process. It's kind of funny because we just moved into new offices here in Washington, and I unboxed like tons of stuff that I haven't looked at in 15 years. And it was really cool because very early in my career, I worked for one of those political organizations, political advocacy organizations, specifically more in tax policy, which is why I have the tax policy background. But I was super involved in electing or not electing of getting appointments to the federal courts and the Supreme Court to get those through during George W. Bush's administration. And at the time, I kind of didn't. I mean, I understood the scope, but I didn't fully understand the impact of it. You know, I was a young kid. I'm like, let's go. Like, I want to get results right now. I want to see I want immediate gratification. Here I am, fast forward 20 years, and look at where we are. It's a more friendly and just a more friendly Supreme Court that looks more, is a little bit more strict in their constitutional interpretation or the interpretations of the Constitution, more industry friendly in terms of how industry sees it. And if you told 24-year-old Karen that this is how this was all going to play out, I wouldn't have believed you. But as I was unpacking all this old memorabilia from these campaigns for federal judgeships and their nominations to also the Supreme Court ones, it's pretty cool to look back on that. 20 years ago, there were way smarter people than me, like super, super smart people that actually were, even prior to 20 years, were thinking the strategy through. Because the Constitution doesn't really change, but how you work within the courts does. So basically, bottom line, if you want to come to Washington, find the opportunity, whether it's on the Hill or within an advocacy organization, start to build your bona fides, but also volunteer on political campaigns, because that's how you're going to build your network and build your skill set.
Excellent advice. And I think for someone, like I said, if I would have heard this 20 years ago, it would have changed the direction of what I would have done, because I'm passionate about vehicles, but then also the policy side as well. And I think for people who are in their careers, they're not interested in policy, but they want to help, that SEMA is such a fantastic organization to be able to join, contribute to, help you guys with these fights and these changes that you're leading to make it easier to repair, easier to have a business, easier to modify your vehicle. So it was fantastic to chat with you today, Karen. I know you're very busy. I appreciate your time today explaining what this deregulation is, what it means, what to expect in the future, and some really cool things that SEMA is working on. So again, thank you for your time, your expertise. It was fantastic to chat with you.
Thanks, Patrick. Appreciate the opportunity, as always.
Don't forget, diesel fans, make sure and head on over to Kershaw.kaiusa.com. Use code TDP2520 to get 20% off your entire cart. If you're in the market for a new knife for hunting, fishing, EDC, something around the job site, around the house, they got you covered with a bunch of different choices for blade steel, blade shape, handle design, different opening mechanisms, and their whole lineup's designed to meet any budget that you might have. We really appreciate them offering that discount code just for Diesel Podcast listeners. So again, if you're in the market, head on over to Kershaw.kaiusa.com. Use code TDP2520 and get 20% off your order. Also want to give a shout out to some of our Patreon supporters, Tyler Lowen at 23 Diesel, Robert, Cutter Up Rob, all of our other Patreon supporters, all of you who subscribe on YouTube and podcast apps. Follow us on social media. We appreciate all your support here in year 9 of the Diesel Podcast and look forward to bringing you more of the content that you want to hear in 2025. Till next time, keep the shiny side up.